They created an airplane where the pilot had to lie face down, as if in a glass coffin. A machine where the eyes looked straight down at the ground, and life depended on the angle of the chin's tilt. The project was so strange that even the military didn't immediately believe it was capable of flight. But it didn't just take off. It challenged physics itself. People lying under the glass dome endured G-forces that would cause others to lose consciousness. And then, everything suddenly stopped. No catastrophe, no order, no explanation. Only silence and an airplane that vanished without a trace. Why was a project that could have changed aviation erased from history? And who decided that humanity wasn't ready to know how to cheat gravity? Speed is a symbol of dominion over the sky, a mark of mastery for which pilots have always paid with their own flesh. In the sky, a moment decides everything, and every body movement turns into a struggle, not against an opponent, but against nature itself. The higher the speed and the sharper the maneuver, the more merciless becomes the force known as G-force, or acceleration due to gravity. This force, invisible and unavoidable, is capable of defeating even the most seasoned ace. It doesn't tear metal, nor break bones. It switches off consciousness. When a pilot pulls the stick up, the centrifugal force literally drains blood from their head. Everything that was bright and clear a second ago turns gray, then black. First the light disappears, then the sound, and in the end, silence ensues. This isn't an enemy blow, not a shot-down plane, but an internal trap of the body. The organism, accustomed to Earth's gravity, simply isn't built for flight on the edge. Engineers knew that no amount of training makes a person stronger than physics. Vertical G-forces, where the force presses along the spine, are the most dangerous. They cause blood to drain downwards, depriving the brain of oxygen. The pilot loses consciousness for a few seconds, but in the sky, that's enough for everything to end in tragedy. The opposite extreme has its own price. If blood rushes to the head too quickly, the eyes fill with red, blood vessels burst, and the person loses vision. The boundary between life and non-existence here is measured in fractions of a second and degrees of tilt. With every new machine, speed increased, and G-forces became stronger. Pilots learned to breathe in a special way, to tense muscles to keep blood in their head. But this only helped partially. Then engineers wondered, maybe the issue isn't with the person, but with how they sit. If the direction of the force is changed, if the pressure is distributed differently, maybe nature itself can be fooled. It was a daring thought, to question the very principle by which everyone flies. And one day, someone dared to try. In the late 30s, when aviation had ceased to be merely the romance of the sky, and had transformed into a science of survival, in Germany, an idea emerged that initially seemed like madness. What if the pilot didn't sit, as always, but lay down? Not for rest or comfort, but to survive where G-force becomes a killer. When engineers calculated that a person lying horizontally could withstand 4 times more G-force than one sitting, the idea ceased to seem like fantasy. It looked like a chance. This overturned the entire established order of things, not just literally, but in an engineering sense. After all, an airplane where the pilot lies face down had to be redesigned from scratch. The cockpit, instruments, even the very method of control changed, but German engineers weren't afraid of such challenges. In '38, the first prototype, the FS-17 glider, appeared in Stuttgart, without an engine, without weapons, but with one goal: to prove that a person lying horizontally could withstand what was previously considered impossible. Tests were conducted with caution, but the results were astonishing. Pilots, accustomed to fighting their own bodies, now felt different. G-force was distributed across the entire body, not just pressing on the spine. Instruments showed 14 Gs, and the person was still conscious. This opened up a perspective that hadn't even been discussed out loud before. If the body position is changed, the very nature of flight can be changed. From this moment, the idea stopped being an experiment by university enthusiasts. It became a matter of state interest, where everything related to speed, durability, and aerial supremacy instantly fell under military attention. It was then that German research circles began to say, the future of fighters might look different. Not a sitting hero in the cockpit, but a pilot lying face to the sky, as if merging with the airplane itself. The student laboratory, resembling a club of sky-obsessed individuals, suddenly found itself at the epicenter of the state machine. Akaflieg Berlin, a group of young engineers and lecturers who had been building gliders for years out of enthusiasm and curiosity, didn't get to enjoy the fruits of their experiments before the science itself received a new client with ironclad requirements. Under pressure from the new regime, academic freedom quickly transformed. Projects ceased to be just research. They became a resource for defense. This wasn't a soft transition to another niche, but a rigid reclassification. The laboratories were supplied with blueprints, materials, and, crucially, tasks that couldn't be ignored. A clear list appeared in the mandatory documentation. The pilot must be in a prone position, face down. Cockpit visibility must be high. Acceleration during dive must be sharp and effective. The airplane must behave predictably at its limits and withstand enormous G-forces. When the specifications prescribed the ability to withstand up to 22.5 Gs, this ceased to be a challenge for hobby engineers and turned into a national-scale task. Students faced a dilemma: work for science or for a war machine that would decide the outcome of others' fates. The practical work also changed. Instead of theoretical seminars, secret meetings with the military began. Safety requirements increased and deadlines shortened. Sometimes projects were passed from hand to hand for reasons that weren't clear to everyone: technical difficulties, political intrigues, or simply the allocation of resources between departments. Thus, ideas born in university workshops entered development, but now with the stamp of state priority. Young designers, who yesterday discussed aerodynamics over coffee, were now writing reports for the ministry, drawing new instrument panels, and seeking answers to questions that challenged the very shape of the pilot's cockpit. Work proceeded at an accelerated pace. Glider tests, strength calculations, reinforcement of structures, and in every decision, a compromise between the idea and the possibilities, materials, engine, available time. Against this backdrop, it became obvious. The experiment with the prone pilot ceased to be an academic curiosity and turned into an attempt to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. When the new Index B9 appeared on the blueprints, even among the Akaflieg Berlin engineers, there was a feeling that they were creating not an airplane, but a laboratory on wings. Everything about this machine contradicted conventional canons: the shape of the fuselage, the arrangement of controls, the very posture of the person inside. The pilot didn't sit. They lay like a swimmer, stretched out along the axis of the fuselage. Their gaze was focused not on the instrument panel, but on a transparent glass dome that smoothly transitioned into the nose section, creating the sensation that the division between the person and the sky itself had vanished. This cockpit looked like something from the future. The entire front section of the airplane was glazed. Otherwise, the pilot lying face down would only see the metal beneath them. The instruments, so as not to obstruct the view, were moved back behind the head, and a clever solution was devised for reading them. A small mirror reflected the readings into the pilot's field of view. Even this minor invention became a symbol of the project's spirit: to bend the familiar for a single purpose, to subject physics to human capabilities. The control sticks and levers had to be reinvented. Instead of the usual central stick, there were two side grips, so the pilot could control without crossing their hands. The feet were responsible for the rudder and brakes, but here too, engineers faced a new anatomy of flight. In the prone position, muscles worked differently, and every movement required millimeter precision. A support, a so-called chin rest, was placed under the chin so the neck wouldn't tire during long flights. A detail pilots would later both criticize and praise simultaneously. The airplane's fuselage, made of steel tubes covered with wood and fabric, resembled a hybrid of a glider and a combat machine. To withstand enormous G-forces, the structure was reinforced internally, especially in the wings, where every spar and rib underwent double strength checks. Two Hirth HM500 engines of 100 horsepower each were placed under the wings, driving simple two-bladed propellers. This wasn't enough for records, but the B9's goal wasn't speed. It was to prove the viability of the idea. When the prototype was rolled out of the hangar in the spring of '43, it looked like a visitor from another era: compact, low, with a long glass nose and a strange pilot seating arrangement. Those who saw it for the first time couldn't decide whether it was an experimental airplane or a capsule built to conquer some new limits. But that was precisely the point. The B9 was meant to be not just a machine, but a boundary between what humans were accustomed to doing in the air and what they hadn't yet dared. The spring of 1943 became the moment when the blueprint came to life. Dozens of test pilots, from students to seasoned aviators, took turns lying in the glass capsule of the new airplane. On the first day, April 10th, the air was cold, the sky was low, and everything happening resembled a scientific experiment more than the birth of the future. But when the engine roared and the fuselage began to vibrate, it became clear that not just the machine's strength was being tested, but also the limit of the human body. The first takeoff was cautious. The airplane was obedient, although controlling it was unusual. Flights continued day after day, and the more data the engineers collected, the stronger grew the feeling that they had stumbled upon something truly important. Pilots, lying face down, withstood G-forces at which, in conventional fighters, a blackout would already occur. In one test, instruments recorded 8.5 Gs during pull-out from a dive, and the pilot not only remained conscious, but didn't even notice that they had reached a critical value. The test reports looked like statistics of victories: 6 Gs in a sustained spiral climb for several seconds without loss of coordination, smooth diving, instantaneous control responses, and, most importantly, not a single case of loss of vision or consciousness. It seemed the idea itself had changed the laws of flight. Pilot feedback included words like, "amazingly comfortable, everything is at hand, visibility is excellent." The only complaints concerned minor issues no one had thought of on the ground. The chin eventually tired on the rigid support, and the legs, if the pedals weren't perfectly adjusted to the height, started to feel numb. Several test pilots suggested doing warm-up exercises before flying, simple movements to prevent blood from stagnating. And it worked. By October, over 30 flights had been recorded. One minor incident with landing gear damage only added confidence in the construction's reliability. The machine was back in service 3 weeks later. The atmosphere in the hangar resembled the enthusiasm of pioneers, as if a new standard of aviation was about to be born. Everything indicated that lying down allowed not just for flying an airplane, but for controlling the limits of human capability. By the end of October 43, the B9 was still in the hangar, clean, without signs of damage, ready for new flights. But a blank line suddenly appeared in the test logs. No date, no comments, no plans. Everything that had been discussed as the next flight just yesterday suddenly vanished from the agenda. Test pilots came to the airfield and saw their airplane standing under a tarp, as if someone had pressed pause in the middle of a grand experiment. There was no explosion, no catastrophe, no order to stop, but the silence was louder than any report. Engineers who had recently been filling out G-force reports sat in the laboratory without tasks. Pilots asked if it would continue, but no one knew the answer. Even those closest to the ministry received no explanations. Some speculated that resources were simply reallocated. Others whispered that the higher-ups decided to suspend purely research programs. But officially, nothing. The B9 wasn't declared a failure, sent for repair, or scrapped. It simply ceased to exist in the schedule. Only an ominous silence remained at the airfield. In the evenings, mechanics passing the covered airplane said they felt uneasy. Too alive a machine to just freeze like that. Everyone expected an order to roll it out, refuel, and take it back to the sky. But day turned into day, and the order never came. It was as if an invisible curtain descended over the project along with the onset of cold weather. And the longer the silence lasted, the stronger grew the feeling that this pause concealed not an accident, but something more. A change that was about to overturn everything they considered important. The autumn of '43 brought Germany not reports of success, but a chain of alarming news. First, a blow came from the south that no one expected. Italy, a longtime ally, withdrew from the war. Its capitulation meant the southern border was now unprotected, and thousands of German soldiers had to be urgently moved to where confidence once reigned. A few weeks later, Allied forces entered Rome, and heavy bombers roared over German cities. By this time, the rear was no longer safe. Kassel was ablaze for a week. Thousands of homes burned, tens of thousands were left homeless, streets turned into ruins. In Berlin, the power was turned off every night for fear of another raid. People slept in basements, and engineers, who had recently been drawing diagrams for new airplanes, were now digging trenches around factories to protect the workshops from fires. The front in the east was also cracking. Soviet troops were taking Ukrainian cities one after another, and it seemed the entire country's map was gradually turning into a line of retreat. Against this backdrop of chaos, the project born for the sake of science lost its meaning. The B9, slow, experimental, unarmed, looked too refined for an era where not ideas, but shells were counted. The aviation ministry demanded not theoretical achievements, but airplanes capable of flying today and shooting tomorrow. Every resource, every ton of metal, and every engine went to strengthening defense, producing Messerschmitts and jet prototypes that Hitler called miracle weapons. For groups like Akaflieg Berlin, a time of silence and forced oblivion arrived. The idea that a person could fly lying down, withstanding 20 Gs, now seemed a luxury in a world where not falling was more important. The project that promised the future was deemed superfluous in a present where survival was above discovery. Amidst the sirens and ashes, even the most ambitious dreams dissolved into smoke, just as quietly as the B9 vanished from all logs and lists. After the war, the B9's traces ended as abruptly as the project itself. No photos or reports of its final resting place remained in the archives. According to one version, the airplane fell into American hands along with other captured German technology. According to another, it was simply disassembled and scrapped as a useless experiment with no military significance. Neither of these versions is confirmed, but the outcome is the same. The airplane that was supposed to change the concept of flight disappeared, and yet, not without a trace. The paradox of the B9 is that its creators were seeking not a weapon, but an answer to human vulnerability. They were trying to defeat not the enemy, but G-force, that very invisible barrier that for centuries separated the dream of the sky from the limits of the body. Their solution seemed mad, but it is precisely such solutions that drive technology forward. The prone pilot position, tested then on a small wooden machine, would return decades later in the cockpits of jet airplanes, where pilots would once again battle monstrous G-forces, and in space capsules, where the horizontal position would become a safety norm. The idea, born in a student laboratory and stalled in years of chaos, outlived those who drew it on drafting paper. In this lies the strange justice of history. Even what seems useless sometimes is just ahead of its time. The B9 didn't become a weapon, didn't gain fame in battles, and didn't earn a place in museums. But it proved that the limits of human capabilities can be shifted not only by force, but by the audacity of thought. From an anonymous project born in the midst of war, grew an idea that later formed the basis of new generations of pilot seats, anti-G systems, and the very principles of ergonomics in aviation. A machine created in an era of destruction became a harbinger of a future where man doesn't submit to nature, but learns to negotiate with it. And perhaps that is why it is still remembered by those who seek not just speed, but a way to remain human at the boundary of the possible.